Hello, we welcome Professor Kalb here in Bucharest for Sunday afternoon discussion just before going to the protests that are taking place for almost 2 months now. Just a little bit of, let's say, questions and answers and a little bit of debate surrounding this the protests in the region and some other wider topics like middle class and populism. We'll try to discuss this afternoon with my friend and colleague Stefan Guga, who join us here. So, to start the discussion, the conversation, we witnessed protests now in Romania for 2 months. You know very well the situation in Roșia Montană. Now it's also the situation with the fracking in the eastern part. This is being done by an American company, by Chevron. This attracted a lot of people on the streets. It seems that the situation is boiling. It's not only about Romania, but we have protests in Bulgaria for some months now, different intensity. Things are also going on in Hungary, not to mention about the European South, from Italy to Greece and so on. My first question would be, what is happening? Are these movements somehow related? Are there only issues, national issues? Do we witness some sort of cycle against neoliberalism or this global capitalism? What's your view on that?
They're deeply related, and they all spring basically from the what you can almost call secular delegitimation of the liberal capitalist state and the governmental classes that run these states. 2011 is the key date at which that sort of opened up almost worldwide. So there's a lot of systemic properties and commonalities in all these protests, except that the particular way in which they focalize on particular issues differs from nation to nation and differs from moment to moment. That is, of course, very fascinating, and that is how politics works. It works by focalizing, but the focalization is also a smokescreen, because there is a much broader general dissatisfaction and, in a sense, serious delegitimation of current directions of development and power balances going on. But the particular way in which it becomes focalized in each particular case very often takes away the vision of these structural similarities of the places. And that makes it so difficult for all of us to synchronize, to coordinate, to bring it into a common picture, and to lift it up from local particularities to a more general form of claim-making, or general alliance that in fact we ultimately need to find somehow, where we can actually make collective claims on a local, national and transnational level to the powers that matter. And this is, I think, what most of our discussions should be about. How can we find the structural and the universal elements and all the different protests that we see? How can we take all the different issues seriously at the same time, but nevertheless link them into a larger agenda that at the same time exposes the much deeper rift in society that underlays all of this.
Right. But just as a continuation, what would you say would be the reason for this, let's say, lack of solidarity or lack of overlapping? For example, we had this discussion a little bit earlier. The European South. You have protests in Greece for so many years now, you have Italy, Spain, everywhere, but somehow they remain bounded within the national boundaries. What would you see as this kind of, or the same reason with Bulgaria and Romania? Pretty similar issues, pretty similar social contexts, yeah. They somehow remain apart within their national boundaries.
Yeah.
What would be the reason for that?
You would almost say nothing is ever learned. And I mean the sheer importance of the nation state. And so the nation state sets up an enormous smokescreen where we all focus on our particular agendas, our particular personalities, particular parties, particular temporal sequences. particular institutions, particular vocabularies that surround these institutions and keep them going. So that is a very general reason why all of this diverges in the end. And if you even, I think you make a correct point by pointing at the European South, which has very similar problems, and they're all part of the Eurozone. They're dealing with basically the same power holders that dictate particular policies, and they fail to make a common front. And popular claim making often makes it worse by focusing on a particular party, the heirs of a particular minister, particular law, etc. Of course, it's important and necessary to fight these national fights, but the solution never lays on the national level. The solution for structural problems that are structural problems within capitalism is minimally on a European level, addressable, but not lower than that. And of course, Europe works in such a way that it sets up all these nation states. Europe is the ultimate savior of the nation state, right? It's not a transnational framework. It's a multilateral, multinational framework. So it always gives the issue back to particular national states, where it gets transformed into a particularity of that state. Either it's the Greeks that are lazy, or it's a particular party that is not functioning well. So it becomes very, very difficult to do that. And even in the Eurozone, in countries with more or less similar left-wing traditions, you see that synchronization and coordination becomes very, very difficult. But it's also, of course, also a power issue. I mean, there was a bit of hope, I think, when Syriza came close to power and Hollande won power, that Hollande would in any case be able to create a southern alliance within the Eurozone. And for a little while his rhetoric pointed in the direction that he was willing to do that. But of course France is never going to do that. It wants to compete with Germany, so it lets its terms of action dictated by the Germans, and so you don't want to have all these undeserving nations on your tail. So it fell immediately apart. So all of this is also part of the power differences in the whole field. And as long as we cannot address these systematic power differences and also aim our arrows at them, aiming at redressing them, which is ultimately a European issue and not a national issue, I think we will be thrown back into fragmentation to the national level and to even further local levels, and ultimately do a lot of identity politics that lead to a lot of fuss and a lot of engagement perhaps, but cannot really lead to sustainable and foreseeable claims over the longer term, material claims, things that have an effect, right? That's material.
So you're not optimistic about the European Union at the level of politics. And it's always this inevitable question, I have to bring it up. What is the role of the EU here? Except for this fragmentation that you just mentioned, in terms of like offering the possibility or not to have this transnational politics at the EU Parliament, or do you see any sort of possibility there, or is just
there's a million of possibilities, but they're simply not on the table. It's the powers that be don't want them on the table, but also the powers that do not be, that is us, and all the people who are walking in demonstrations, do not make these claims. Right? There is basically no discourse about how the European Union should change. Where is this? Are we walking for that? But of course that is part of a set of crucial issues, really, right? You want to have a political union, you want to have European political parties, you want to have a chosen president there, you want to have a European public sphere, and if you create these things, you can start to, why not let the EU tax instead for 1%, tax all the incomes for 5%, and of course progressively. I mean, it's the higher earners that profit most from the transnationalization that happens within the European Union. Okay, let the EU then tax them. It's precisely these higher earners that are so difficult to tax because they are so mobile and so internationalized, are so difficult to tax by the national states. Now let the European Union do that, and let them use the money to really do some redistribution. We could have a set of European social minima, for example. So there's a lot of possibility there, but nothing of this is part of the vision of the people who are walking in demonstrations. And that is understandable and predictable because everybody's so focused on their very particular issue at a particular moment in time in a particular place. But nevertheless, this keeps sort of distracting. So I'm in fact optimistic because I think that these things can be done. But I'm pessimistic because I know that these things must be done and we don't see them even being put on the table explicitly. So we really need a European left. I think that European left can only really be created by the Northwest European left. The North as a start, right? They should make the gesture and they have also the resources, the intellectual and the material resources to start to organize this. They could easily take the lead. But you know, what do the Swedish Social Democrats or the SPD do these days? You know, they also think, fuck the Greeks, they're lazy and all of that. So we have a very serious problem. But there is a lot of things could be done.
I mean, I want to say a couple of things about Zorin's initial question, like why we don't see these particular protests becoming more interlinked or more connected and eventually emerging as into like supporting a broader movement, or being organized into a broader European left movement. I think that to add to what you just said, there are two very important things which we see right now. First of all, there is a very important symbolic issue that here we are still faced with this aura of the entirely civilized European, Western, whatever, politician, administrator, tourist, who simply cannot be corrupt, who simply is not engaged in actual power relations, it's not about actually existing institutions and structures of inequality. It's more about us becoming integrated into this sort of entirely ideal community that is Europe. It's civilized, we should be European, we should become European, and that's where we see a lot of discussions, a lot of cleavages forming precisely around this purely symbolic issue. And then there's a more practical thing. I think that why reaching out, for example, for reaching out to the Bulgarian protesters is very difficult, is the fact that these protests are still they lack force. Right? So the sheer force is quite small. So when you have and that implies a lot of immediate tactical problems that need to be solved, and many of these, you can't find a solution to them as long as the protests remain at a rather small scale. So reaching out across the borders would be, of course, an issue that it would prove to be crucial if we would be really at this stage at which we have sort of like solved these immediate tactical issues, like how do we get more people out on the streets? This proves to be, I think, a more urgent issue than reaching out to the Bulgarian protesters. I don't know exactly what that would mean, if that would be that beneficial right now to invest the little energies that the protests have right now towards these entirely legitimate goals.
Yeah, but these are short-term tactical considerations, right? And there's a whole set of dilemmas connected to that which you can't solve, which will come back all the time. I mean, you always make partly wrong choices, partly practical choices. And the trouble is that much of political discussion remains focused on that direct tactical level, right? And of course, egos are being made in that, reputations are being made in that, and are being destroyed in it all the time. Because these are serious dilemmas and you can't solve them. I want to say a few words about the civilizational issue, right? Where ultimately Bulgarians have to learn to be Germans and the And the Romanians have to learn to be French and all of that. Everybody has to learn to be different in the current context. That is true, perhaps not so much of the Germans, even they have a very sort of inward-looking discussion about what is failing in German leadership and in German institutions. But it's true all over the world. The UK is punishing itself because it's living beyond its means. The Dutch are punishing themselves because they have been living massively beyond their means. The French cannot innovate and are institutionally retarded. Similar stories for the Spanish, similar stories for the Greeks. We are all sharing in a discourse where basically capital tells us that we are all insufficient. And we're all insufficient in our particular way, in our particular slot. But it's a very universal property that all these peoples, we are the people, but all these peoples are insufficient in their particular way. So again, I think it's very important for all of us who do politics and who study politics and act within the moment, is to start to understand these universal properties within all these particular situations, right? The transparency issue is of course a very big one here, because certainly the East European nations have had these arrows being focused on them in terms of corruption. And of course they've been fighting with political elites that were corrupt. So they tend to take that blame very seriously, and then they tend to internalize it. Of course, there's a whole European machinery and whole NGO machinery that is keeping these arrows in place all the time. Morgan Stanley has just paid $9 billion fine because of its deep corruption, right, in the heart of Wall Street. Siemens has paid a 400 million fine in Germany for corrupting all the cities in Europe and selling their trams. Similar stories, of course, for BP in the Gulf, etc., etc. Nobody is more corrupt than anybody else. Corruption is a set of systematic structures in the system as such, and the biggest corruption is in the biggest cores of the system. There is certainly no doubt about that. I mean, all these people are so concerned in Romania or in Bulgaria about the corruption of their elites, which is about a few millions here and a few millions there, or even just a few hundred euros here and a few thousand there. Are they aware that the Western banking system at some point had its shadow banking system, where about the whole global GDP, $50 trillion, was just stocked away and nobody knew about it? And of course they were paying themselves from it. It's apparently not part of the discussion on transparency in Romania and Bulgaria, but I would really like political actors to be very aware here that these are universal properties of a capitalism that's going already in all sorts of ways, and where everybody is being thrown back in their particular corrupted position and their particular histories of corruption, transnational and local histories of corruption, where everybody's starting to blame themselves. But it is so important to turn these self-victimizing discourses around and keep pointing, also analytically, focusing on what the larger structures are. And then I think it is very clear that all these nations are in a situation where very large populations are very angry or even enraged about the growing inequalities, the growing disempowerment all over the board. In Eastern Europe, 50% of the population doesn't even vote, so they basically believe that they don't have a stake in the system at all and that the system is corrupt and rotten. So they're not claiming their citizenship potentialities, and they think, go to hell with it, apparently. In Western Europe, it's 30-35% that thinks it. Is that such a drastic difference? No, it's just a little difference. In the US, it's also 50% that's voting, right? It's a European, an East European condition there. So we're all in this shit together. So I really want to move away from all these very particularities and these particular discourses that allow us to blame ourselves all the time. We shouldn't really participate in that, even though, of course, the problems of corruption are serious in all these cases. But you're universal.
Yeah, but I totally agree. I think it's a very good point. But let me give you this slightly different perspective from the Romanian example of these few months, where you have this discourse which, in a sense, more or less acknowledges the corruption of the big capital, for example, or the systemic corruption of the capital. Okay, maybe I'm a little bit exaggerating, it was not this kind of, this was that visible, but let's, assume that it's in place, and in some instances it was there, but the response to it was, okay, then what we need is not to have this huge banks, big corporations, big business. We should go back to some small capitalism with a human face, local initiative, small relations, small business, saving the people. Part of it was part of the discourse of Occupy as well. It's also part of the Tea Party discourse, and it's part of some other, so let's say, progressive or even leftist initiatives like save capitalism. The small capitalism from the big capitalism, or save the markets, for example. So I was wondering how to preserve this perspective of the systemic corrupt nature of capitalism without falling into this what I would call a trap of localism or local initiative.
Yeah. Yeah. Are they breaking up the banks? Are they breaking up the big monopolies in all the important branches of the global economy? You have 3 or 4 big players, not more than that. It's a thoroughly oligopolistic situation, right? Everything that Marx predicted about this has come true. There's basically no liberal these days that would deny that. Everybody knows that. Where is the power to break them up? Is it actually useful to break them up? I have no answers to that, but I think it's enough to see that it's simply not happening. So we simply have to deal with capitalism as a big elephant in the room, and of course we can only hit at particular parts of it from our particular positions, but that's so precisely so why it's so important to make these transnational alliances, because it is an international beast, right? And you can talk about regulation, and you can talk about morality within the system and all of that. That is fine. But the hope that technocrats will solve our political problems is a completely vain one. That will not happen. They will, of course, again, create a lot of smoke screens around it and create a lot of sort of monitoring systems. But they cannot reverse that direction of development which leads to ever larger concentration of monopoly power or oligopolistic power. So that would be my answer to it. Which of course brings up a new issue here, because I think that the left has been much too utopian over the last, it's a gesture toward liberalism over the last 20 years in cherishing small is beautiful, cherishing small-scale ecological and democratic utopias, cherishing the urban scale or even the regional and the village scale, etc. It's understandable why this has happened, because the big thought of communism has fallen apart. Right? It's either the big thought of communism, and then you have a structural analysis of what's wrong in capitalism, and you want to pose yourself as an antagonism to that. And it can go under the banner of communism, or it can be called something else. It can be called Roosevelt's Four Freedoms, or I don't know what. But it's that sort of antagonism in any case. Or that big antagonism falls apart, and then you start to dream about creating resistance economies, alternative life worlds, and ultimately all sorts of nice identity politics on a local level. I increasingly start to think that we are at the point that we should sort of recognize that the political potentialities of that micro-imagination are becoming pretty exhausted.
Okay, so before we talk a bit about more about the political categories in which we can think about what's happening right now in Romania and in recent with these protests, can you tell us a bit about what do you think about resource exploitation and the exploitation of natural resources. Apparently, everybody's talking about it, at least here, that this has become very important nowadays, and we sort of have to get ourselves hooked into this stream of investment and jobs and all that coming in this sector. So are we really dealing with a surge in the search for natural resources in the world at large, or is this just is it about the fact that we are witnessing growing industrial expansion and you need more resources to sustain that, or is it maybe a profit fix for profitability fix for capital, or both maybe? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think first Romania. The discussion about the Romanian economy has always been about resources. So there is really nothing new there. You also don't need to worry. They will come to you. You don't need to invite them, you don't need to find them, the investors. They will come to you, right? Romania is one of the very few places in Europe with a large potential resource base. So they will find you out. There is no doubt about that, right? And the fact that Chevron has been talking to the government is only evidence of that. I guess that the government has not been frantically searching for a possibility to talk to either Shell or BP or Chevron. No, they sought out your government. So they will be coming in any case. Which of course immediately leads to the conclusion that you don't need to worry, right? You have a set of bargaining tools here. They will come to you, they will ask you something. It's not the other way around, they will ask you something, and that means that you can actually pose your conditions to them. And the conditions are, of course, in terms of royalties. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to be against resource exploitation. Even though in particular cases you can certainly be against it, and you can certainly be against the particular modes, technical modes, and the political conditions under which it works. But given that Romania is not such a very rich nation and people are not so satisfied with their income, I guess, it makes a lot of sense to allow them in somehow. But please ask for serious royalties, and royalties in the system worldwide have been screwed up enormously over the last 20 years. And so they're always somewhere between, I think, 30 or 50% these days. And so please don't go below that. Don't offer yourself. That's a very simple recommendation, I think. But of course, in the system as such, there has been an increasing frantical search for new resources. And commodities prices have been very high, resource prices have been very high. All of this is related to the urbanization of the world. In 2007, the world became a majority urban, as you know. And of course, the industrialization of China. And all of that. So these are a set of global conditions that certainly put countries like Romania or Ukraine in a slightly special position, where you can actually start to bargain more strongly and strictly than you used to be able to do 20 years ago. So I think that's the position here. Whether you should be happy that it is Chevron and that the Americans will come to save you, I don't think that is the case, right? Of course, it's for all of the geopolitical positions in Eastern Europe. It is fortunate if you are less dependent on Russia. That is clear, and you don't want Russia to be in such a monopolist position, I think, generally. But whether the Americans are going to save you, and they're actually going to come and save you from a gas crisis, or I think that is a very open question. I mean, the Brits or the French or the Norwegians could do that too. You don't necessarily need the Americans for that. Romania has a long history of seeking very far away alliances. First the French, of course, and then later the Americans. But when it really mattered, these alliances never really worked. And so I think again, lean back. They will seek you out, they will come to you, and please pose your conditions. And talk to the Latin Americans, learn from the Latin Americans. Don't be so happy with transnational capitalist investment. It will come in any case. But if you're too happy with it, you're losing out in the bargaining.
But you need a political power to, from the left, but also from the, let's say, right as well. I mean, political power in general to exert pressure over the state to have this revenues negotiated in a transparent way or to the benefit of the state.
Yeah.
Whereas that's exactly what's happening now. That's why we have this protest, because we really have no power over the state to push the politicians and the state itself towards more positive or rewarding outcomes of these exploitations. And I think that's the question that we all face now with this protest: which way to go in order to be able to exert some pressure. Not to mention achieving some sort of long-term goal with these negotiations.
That seems to me a very important goal. And again, I think there are very interesting similarities with Latin America and Romania and Bulgaria. And it's not because I want to put you in the global south camp necessarily, and not in the western one. I mean, you're certainly part of Europe and the EU and all of that. But you can learn from Latin America here that if you want to forge your state in a direction that makes it tougher on the transnational capitalists and more accountable to an underlying population, you need mobilizations, you need quite sustained mobilization, you need political party formation, you need very strong claims from social movements on political parties being made accountable to real constituencies, so not sort of, internet-based media spectator sort of parties, but real parties. And in all of these cases, you see that you have a neo-nationalist plus a critical leftist alliance, right? That is also true in Latin America. And don't forget that the left in Latin America encapsulates the neo-nationalists. And that is of course not the case in Eastern Europe. So I'm not surprised at all to see you marching together, even though you are bien étonnés to look at each other and say, well, are we in this together? Yeah, I think you're in this together. And it's very predictable that this happens. In other situations in Latin America, you're actually in one party.
No, because we had this moment this week with the confrontation with these neo-nationalists, let's call them. It was not very pleasant at all, and it's always a question that comes up: what to do in this context. I mean, you really have this pressure of, on one hand, as you said, joining up with this neo-nationalist camp, and even allowing some space for these nationalist arguments because they were very good for mobilizing people. That's why we have these huge numbers in the streets, because nationalism crept in and could bring people out. On the other hand, you have the danger where you can't control this. I think at least in Romania, we're heading into a situation where we have on one hand this, let's say, corrupt political class.